This is PowerPoint presentation uh, 2.5 on the Great Depression and the New Deal. Let's start with the onset of the Depression. Now, it is often misunderstood that the cause of the Great Depression was the stock market crash. It's not entirely true. The stock market crash really wasn't the cause of the Depression. It contributed to it, but it was more of a indicator that there was something wrong in the economy. We talked at some length in the lecture on the 1920s that while things seemed on the surface to be booming in the United States, underneath the surface there were significant structural failures in the economy. Most notably, a strain on the banking system caused because of the overissuance of credit. This is similar to what we saw in the 1890s. Now, when it comes to the stock market, what we have this translating into, or the episode of it in the stock market, was as a result of the apparent boom in the economy and the availability of credit. People bought stocks more than they normally would have. As a result, this increased demand for stock certificates. This, in turn, increased their price to an artificially high level. Okay, so the stocks were trading for more than the companies were actually worth. How they were able to do this was through borrowed money and through what's referred to as buying on the margin. You could buy stocks for downwards of 70% their value and then pay the balance off at a later time, okay, which was easy to do because the stocks were going up so precipitously, increasing in value, as it were, that you could, at a later time, cash in and pay off the debt and pocket yourself a nice piece of change in the process. As a result of this, the demand for stocks artificially raised the price of them and reflected what was an unrealistic value in these companies. We had a similar incident in 2000s, just before the 2008 banking crisis, where portfolios were worth, in general, their paper value was about 30% more than their actual value. And that's what we have here. And you see down at the bottom that U.S. Steel, in a matter of weeks, plummeted from $262 a share to $22 a share, which actually was closer to the actual value of the share. And Montgomery Ward, which was the nation's and the world's largest retail outlet, went from $138 to $4. And so now there's kind of a little principle that you might want to keep with you through life, because it'll get you a lot further than anything you learn in a history course or an economics course. Stock market is a very funny thing. Same things for mutual funds, any investments of this nature, okay? You only lose money when you sell, okay? People lost money during the stock market crash the way they did because they panicked. They saw a stock go from $262 down to $22, and they panicked and sold it all off. And so they lost enormous amounts of money, okay, based on how much depending on how much they bought it for. If they'd waited and allowed for the stock to come back up, at least to the value they paid for it, then they wouldn't have lost anything. So normally why people lose money in the stock market isn't even necessarily because of bad investments, it's because they panic. We now get to the contributory causes per se specifically. First of these is the agricultural sector. We see a very similar phenomenon taking place in the agricultural sector that happened in the 1890s. Okay, you know, the structural problems in the economy are inherent in the economy. We see them repeated. Okay, they repeat themselves throughout U.S. history. For example, in U.S. History 1, we look at the Panic of 1837. Okay. And we look at the Panic of 1819, and we look at the Panic of 1893. And now we're dealing with the Panic of 1929, 1930 through 33, okay, the Great Depression. Well, what did we see in the 1890s? The agricultural sector had expanded like crazy. They did so on borrowed money. They had over leveraged themselves. They had mortgaged their farms. And then demand for their product goes away. Well, here it's just slightly different because the reason, and we talked about this during the discussion of the First World War, the reason that they expand their productive capacity so much is to meet the increased demand, principally from Europe. Okay, well, after the war, after a brief period of rebuilding, the European demand for American agricultural products drops to about 50% of its wartime level. As a result, the farmers are left with enormous amounts of unused capacity. Okay, unused capacity, which forced them to go into hock. Okay, to borrow money and to over leverage themselves. Well, now that demand has collapsed, of course, what do we know? When demand drops like that, the price is going to collapse. And so the price for farm products drops. Because the price of farm products drops and demand drops, they can't make enough money. And there you see their deteriorating terms of trade. Okay, so as a result of this, they have less money coming in. Actually, less money than it's going to take them to pay off their debts. Now, furthermore, in the 1920s, as we discussed during that lecture, the progressives had fallen on hard times. Okay, they had been discredited as a result, largely of a number of factors, among them the Bolshevik Revolution. But progressivism had been equated to communism and Bolshevism, and so we had this Red Scare that swept the nation. Well, as a result of that, the conservatives in America will sweep back into political power. And so we'll have Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover as presidents in the 1920s, all of them one-term presidents, all of them conservative, all of them pursuing a laissez-faire economics policy, all of them pursuing a loose monetary policy. Okay, well, part of this, along with this, goes the attempt to cultivate manufacturing by imposing still greater tariffs. Okay, and so we have the Tariff Act of 1924. That's going to increase the price of manufactured goods, which is what tariffs do. We've covered that on previous occasions in previous lectures. When you pass a tariff, it's going to increase the price of products, not just imported products, but American products too, because when you increase the price of foreign imports, American producers can raise their price to match that. Okay? And so as a result of this, and as a result of continuing consolidations in the manufacturing sector in the United States, we saw this in the last lecture. We saw the domination of the major three auto producers, etc. Okay? Well, what did we see before when that happened in the late 19th century? We saw business practices that were of a less than scrupulous nature. We saw price fixing. We saw artificially high price levels. Again, we want to remember this and bounce it off what we talked about in the preceding slide. Okay? What we saw in the stock market, what we see in the American economy through the 1920s is an illusion, a will-o'-the-wisp, okay? Like sand in your hand that just slips through. All that growth was mythical. Okay, that growth was based on these increased prices and these consolidations. But in point of fact, productivity wasn't nearly as high as people were led to believe. Okay, well, as a result of these tariffs and these consolidations, and we had artificially high prices in manufactured goods, and so now again we look at the terms of trade of the agricultural sector. Demand had dropped, so their money in goes down. The price of manufactured goods goes up, so their money out goes up. To compensate for that deficit, they borrow still more money, okay, and become even further over leveraged. And so you have from the agricultural sector a tremendous strain on the banking system, as you did in the 1890s. And the problem is, and this is what you see down there at the end, and we've talked about this, I've mentioned this before, eventually the piper has to be paid. You can borrow money and borrow money and borrow money, and eventually you have to pay. In fact, it reminds me, skipping ahead a bit, when we get to Epoch 3, and we get into the 1990s and 2000s, the political columnist and analyst, George Will, offered my favorite quote for ultimately what caused the banking crisis of 2008. Americans had, for a period of about 20 years, treated themselves to a spending spree that they could not afford. That's the 1920s. Beginning really in about 1920, Americans, your average American, these are not corporations. Remember what I said. This is not a question of so much commercial borrowing as individual borrowing. The Americans treat themselves to a spending spree that they can ill afford. Okay, well, you can do that for a while. You can borrow money. You can go into hock. You can go into debt, sure. And you can continue to leverage yourself. You can do that for a period of time, no question about it. But eventually the piper has to be paid. Eventually those loans come due. And when they come due, if you can't finance it, okay, in the case of the agricultural sector, because of diminishing terms of trade or deteriorating terms of trade, then you can't pay back the banks, and the banks go into a crisis. The mining sector also contributed to this. Okay, they had, like the agricultural sector during the First World War, expanded their productive capacity to meet wartime demand. The war is over, and this is a familiar story by now for us. You should be able to say this in your sleep, okay? After the war, after a brief period of reconstruction, demand for American mining, extraction products collapses. As a result, the price of their products drops. This is exacerbated, you see there at the top, by increases in the petroleum industry, which caused the coal industry to go down. And we mentioned in the 1920s and in the lecture on the 1920s that the coal industry took it on the nose in the 1920s. Okay? Well, this is why. It's because, one, they had unused capacity that they developed during the war to meet wartime demand, which was now sitting idle. And two, the expansion of the petroleum industry gave an alternative energy source to coal. And so coal prices collapsed during the 1920s. And so again, you have deteriorating terms of trade similar to the agricultural sector. To meet the debt obligations, they mortgage their mines, they mortgage their facilities, they over-leverage themselves, they go into hock. And so it's very much like the agricultural sector, with the result being a massive debt in the mining sector. Stock trading, I kind of mentioned in the first line. We talked about the stock market crash. In 1925, the total value of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange was $27 billion. Now, that's that image of the artificially high value of the stocks caused by an artificially high demand, which is allowed, okay, which is made possible by borrowing to buy your stocks and by buying on the margin, okay? And that's what you see at the end, fueled by leveraged buying and speculation, paying a percentage of value on and borrowing the balance. By 1932, the value of them drops to $15 billion, which is a little bit more realistic as to the actual value. And if you measure that against the beginning of the 1920s, in the 1920s, one of the things I cited was that during the 1920s, you have a 40% growth, which is on average 4% a year. If you use the $15 billion figure of 1932, it's a little bit more realistic, and it's a little less growth than those figures would show. And you see that by the time of the crash in 29, the stocks in 25 had gone from $27 billion in value to $81 billion in value. And again, this demonstrates rather emphatically, I should think, the effect it has on the value of the stocks, and it's all artificial. And that's why I said it in the 1920s lecture too, is that all this growth and prosperity, the roaring 20s, okay, that time we think of as the roaring 20s, where the Charleston was. They had some cool dances. I'm not much of a dancing man myself, but give the devil his due. In the 1920s, they had some cool dances and cool music. Oh, one of the things, like I mentioned, that show, The Boardwalk Empire. Oh, they got some. If you like that music they got some great music in there. The soundtrack of that is outstanding. You got Billie Holiday. You got all kinds of things in there. So at any rate, it triples in value in a period of about 4 years. Okay, this is all because of this margin buying, which creates an artificial demand which artificially inflates the value of the stock. Um, in addition to this, you have technological improvements in industry. Okay, because with technological improvements in industry, one of the things that we go over in economics classes, we have in economics we have three different types of unemployment. You might be familiar with this from your economics background if you have any. You have three types of unemployment. Okay, you have cyclical unemployment, which is the result of a business cycle. That's what happens in a recession. People get laid off work. You have frictional unemployment. This is temporary unemployment where people are switching jobs, or seasonal employment like lifeguards, things like that. Roofing is frictional unemployment. They're unemployed for a brief period of time, usually not to exceed 6 months. And then you have structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is permanent. It's where the job is not coming back. The number one reason for structural unemployment, what gets blamed for structural unemployment incorrectly, is the relatively recent, meaning the last 40 or 50 years. That's how you know a historian. A historian says relatively recent, they mean the last 50 years. Okay, so yeah, relatively recently. The other day, my wife always says that something happened 3 years ago. She's like, the other day you said, yeah, right, that was 3 years ago, dear. But at any rate, that's how you know a historian. Okay, so the other day, with this outsourcing stuff, they blame outsourcing for the major cause of structural unemployment. In fact, that's not true. About 2/3, a little bit more, of all structural unemployment, permanent unemployment, is the result not of outsourcing. It's the result of technological innovation. Okay, technological innovation, capital, as it were, reduces the need for human capital, reduces the need for labor. A typical example is, let's suppose that I'm in a business and my business is construction, and what I do is I dig foundations for houses. Okay, well, I sit there and I hire a bunch of guys with shovels to dig a foundation. Okay, well, if I go and get myself a piece of technology, capital equipment, a backhoe, all of a sudden I don't need those guys. Okay, they all get fired. That's structural unemployment. Those jobs aren't coming back. They've been replaced not by foreign workers. They've been replaced by a machine. Well, that's what's going to happen in the 1920s. And so unemployment is going to rise. And between the conservatives in the White House, who are ill-disposed towards labor, as a result of technological improvement, as a result of reduction of production in agriculture, farming, and agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, you're going to have a surplus of labor. Okay, and this is going to begin the trend of unemployment that's going to go all the way through the Great Depression. Okay. In addition to these contributory causes, you also have the banks themselves. Okay, so what do we have? We have from the agricultural sector, from the manufacturing sector, from the mining sector. We have, during the First World War, they borrow money to increase their productive capacity to meet wartime demand. The war ends. After a brief period of reconstruction, demand for their products, particularly overseas, drops. Okay? When demand drops for their products overseas, they're left with all this unused capacity. Demand has dropped, so the price of their products drops. So they have less money coming in. They have less demand, and so they're unable to meet their debt payments. Well, during the war, they had put an awful lot of strain on the banking sector. What's going to happen during the 1920s to attempt to artificially maintain production levels? They're going to continue to borrow money. Because what's been happening? Well, we saw it with the discussion on the slide on agriculture, that you have deteriorating terms of trade. Prices are dropping, prices for commodities are dropping, prices for manufactured goods are going up, so you have less money coming in, more money going out. To compensate for that deficit, to meet that deficit, you borrow money, you mortgage. Okay, you take out second and third mortgages on your homes, on your farms, okay, on your mines, on whatever it is you want to mortgage. This places a strain. Now, in addition to this, you're going to have, for the first time in American history, consumer credit rather than commercial credit. Commercial credit increases supply. Okay, producers borrow money to increase their productive facilities. That increases productive capacity and therefore influences the supply curve and pushes supply up. Well, with consumer credit, it doesn't increase supply directly. It will do so indirectly, or at least hypothetically, it will do so indirectly. It increases demand. The idea being that if you lend people money and they buy things, okay, consumers, if you consumer items, then that will increase demand, and because of the increased demand, supply will increase. It's demand side economics. It's the mainstay of Keynesianism, which we'll get to in just a minute. Okay? Now, add to all of this a series of droughts. This is the time of the Great Dust Bowl from 27 to 32. It's 5 years of subpar rainfall. Okay, a natural consequence, natural right. From 1927 to 32, there is a reduction in the average rainfall in the Midwest, and as a result of these droughts, they can't produce enough crops. Okay, and so this is kind of, people often say that the Dust Bowl itself is the main cause of the Great Depression. That's not true. It will push them over the edge, though. This will push them over the brink. They're on the brink of collapse. The agricultural sector is on the brink of collapse anyways, because they've over-leveraged themselves and they're having great difficulty repaying their debt to the banks. Okay, this pushes them over the precipice. And this will lead to a massive credit crisis. Okay? And so in a real sense, what I want you to try to start to put together in your mind, go back with me, travel back to the late 19th century where our class began, and focus for a second, your attention, just for a second, on that credit crisis of 1893, which led to the Depression. The United States never really has recovered from that. Okay? They limped along. Okay, and you had some growth in the late 1890s and through Theodore Roosevelt into Taft, but for the most part, it was artificial. Okay, we see it amplified in the 1920s. Okay, it's very pronounced in the 1920s, but really from 1914 through 1929, all of that growth is artificial. In World War I, that growth is entirely dependent on the wartime economy. In the 1920s, it's entirely financed by credit. So you have this brief 20-year period where there is some apparent recovery in the American economy. But again, if you look closely at that, all is not what it seems to be. Okay? All right. I mentioned in the last slide the agricultural sector, yes, a contributory cause, no doubt. The mining sector, yes, a contributory cause, no doubt. The manufacturing sector, yes, a contributory cause, no doubt. The reduction in labor, okay, and the rise in unemployment, a contributory cause, no doubt. The banking sector, over-lending money, okay, and then suffering from this credit crunch like in the 1890s, certainly a contributory cause. But for my money, the largest contributory cause is this one right here, the Federal Reserve. And it's very simple to explain, so I want you to understand. The United States is on the gold standard at this time, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture. Because it's on the gold standard, what that means is that paper currency, dollars, are immediately transferable for gold, meaning you can go in and exchange your cash for gold. Nowadays, you can't do that. You can't exchange your money for gold and silver. You can buy gold and silver on the commodities market, to be sure. That's different than the gold standard. That's different than going into a bank and exchanging cash for gold. Okay? Because of that, because of that immediate transferability, there has to be a relationship between the supply of money, meaning cash, and the supply of gold. And I explained this before, and I'll explain it again now with a real simple example of this. Okay? Let us suppose that we have 1 ounce of gold and $100 of cash. Now, what we think of cash as is think of cash as an IOU. Now, in the case where it's transferable for gold, what we have here as a result of the idea of opportunity cost is if we have 1 ounce of gold and $100, 1 ounce of gold equals $100. I can hold either 1 ounce of gold or I can hold $100 or some combination of the two. Okay? Well, if I lend out more paper currency, increase the supply of paper currency to say $200 or $300 or $400, but I don't increase my gold supply. Let's say I now have $400 in paper currency. Okay? Why? Because of consumer credit, because of commercial credit. I've been lending money to farmers and miners, and I've been lending money to consumers to buy appliances and things like that, like we talked about in the lecture in the 1920s. Okay, so I've now got $400 or $500 in paper currency out there for 1 ounce of gold. If everyone at once comes to transfer their $400 for that 1 ounce of gold, okay, each of them is going to get less. Okay, let's say that you have 4 people, each of whom have borrowed $100. Okay, if one of them comes to exchange that $100 for 1 ounce of gold, they would get 1 ounce. If 2 of them come in to exchange, each of them their $100, you now have $200, they're going to get half an ounce each. 3 of them come in, they're going to get a third of an ounce each. 4 of them come in, they're going to get a quarter of an ounce each. Okay, well, the over-lending in the 1890s, this is, what was one of the major contributory causes of the crunch in 1893. It's going to happen again. Okay, it's going to happen again, really beginning in 1932 and 33. To prevent the crisis that happened in 1893 from happening again, Congress passed a law with the Federal Reserve System that the Federal Reserve System could not, the Federal Reserve System was given governance over the banking sector. Okay, this addressed one of the problems from the 1890s, which was that there was no real government control over the banking sector. This would not really give government control because the Federal Reserve is a private organization, but it would give some oversight to the banking sector. Okay, so they're given charge of oversight of the banking sector, and they're told that the banking sector cannot release too much money into the system so that it overwhelms the supply of gold. And the ratio is about 2.5 to 1. You can release 2.5 times your amount of gold in paper currency. So if we want the value of gold to be $100, you can release $250 into the system, okay, but no more. This is based on a probability model. They still kind of work a little bit like this with the reserve requirement, which we'll get to at a much later lecture in Epoch 3. The idea being that, and on any given point in time, on any given day, there's a certain probability of how many people are going to come to the bank to demand their money or to demand to exchange their money for gold in the case of the gold standard here. Okay, so they figure 2.5 to 1. Now the problem with this is that this is why what could very easily have been a recession turns into a depression. Technically speaking, an economic recession is 2 consecutive quarters, that's 6 months, of negative growth in the economy. If it endures generally, and it's somewhat arbitrary, somewhat non-consensually agreed, but if it endures for greater than a year, then you have a depression. Well, what prolongs the recession that hits really at the end of the 20s and amplifies it into what becomes the Great Depression is the fact that the Federal Reserve System is curtailed. It cannot flood the system with money, which is what they did. That's how they fueled the growth in the 1990s and the 2000s. Okay, they flooded the market. How did the first the Bush administration, but then the Obama administration carried the plan out? How did they when the banking crisis hit in 2008 and the economy fell to recession? How did they stimulate the economy back into growth? They pumped it with money. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to the lowest point in U.S. history. They dropped interest rates to 1/4 percentage point. People could borrow money for nothing. And so that fueled demand, and that gave you growth back. And we'll deal with that at a later section back over in Epoch 3. Okay? Well, in 1932, they couldn't do that because the Federal Reserve was curtailed in the amount of money they could release into the system. They had to peg it to the amount of gold that was in the system. Okay? As a result of this, now you see a rash of bank failures. And this is also what's going to internationalize the crisis. The crisis of the Great Depression begins in the United States. It rapidly infects the remainder of the world, first through Europe, and then through the Europeans, it will affect Asia. And all developed sections of the world will be affected. Okay? The bank failures first start in the Midwest. Why is this? Because the Midwest is the breadbasket of the United States. It's the farming sector. Well, it's the farming sector that principally takes it on the nose for reasons that we talked about before. Okay? So those are the banks that are first going to fail. Now, it's a ripple effect. And I want you to understand the ripple effect. We covered at some length how banks make money. Okay? Banks make money by lending money out. Okay, so here we have these banks in the Midwest that have lent money to the farmers in their local communities. Okay? To mortgage their farms so that they can meet expenses. Okay? To increase productive capacity. For whatever reason, they've lent money out. Okay? Well, where did the bank get this money? Well, the bank gets this money from a number of different sources. One of them being, it borrows the money from other banks. Okay? If I'm a banker, and I'm looking, and I know, so the way it works is it's a ripple effect. A bank in the Midwest borrows money from a bank in New York to lend money to a farmer in the Midwest. Simple enough to understand? The bank in New York charges, I'm a Midwest banker, the bank in New York charges me 2% interest. I turn around and charge the farmer 5% interest. Okay, so I make 3% off the money, the bank in New York makes 2% off the money. We're all making money hand over fist. Well, we're making money hand over fist on one condition. The farmer's able to pay it back. As long as the farmer's able to finance that debt, we're all happy. Okay? But if he can't finance that debt, we're all screwed. Okay? Well, where did the bank in New York get its money? Well, the bank in New York got its money through the Federal Reserve, or it borrowed money. And so you see, in December of 1930, the Bank of the United States in New York failed. Okay? And then, as a result of that failure, by May of 31, the Creditanstalt, which is the largest bank in Europe at the time, it's the Bank of Austria, will fail. This internationalizes the crisis because we now see this ripple effect throughout. Okay, and so that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that it's not simply the agricultural sector, the mining sector. Okay, it's within. The financial crisis is within the banking system itself. Okay, we saw it a little bit in the 1890s. We actually saw it in the 1830s. We won't get into that. That's for U.S. History 1. We saw it in the 1890s a little bit. Okay, we see it full force here. We'll see it again in this banking crisis of 2008 that I keep referring to. Okay, that it internationalizes the crisis. Why? Because the banks are all interconnected through interlending. The banks loan money to each other as well. Okay, so because they're all interconnected through this interlending system, once one of them fails, they can't pay their debts back to the other banks. They're going to have a liquidity crunch as well. That's what's going to internationalize the crisis. And so now you see between 30 and 32, 5,000 banks in the United States will fail with a total of $3 billion in deposits. In 33, another 4,000 banks will fail with $3.5 billion in deposits. Okay, so $6.5 billion is going to be sucked out of the system in a little better than a year and a half. And it's an insidious infection. And to give you an idea, characterization of what it was like, you need go no further than one of my favorite movies. It's in my top 5 anyways. It's my favorite Christmas movie. It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, in that one scene where George has just gotten, if you know the movie, if you don't know the movie, you should watch it because it's a great movie. Makes me cry every time I see it. I see the movie and I'm sitting there. My wife and I, this last year, we were watching it and we're both sitting there like little sob cases, with tears rolling down because George Bailey at the end, and it's all very nice and it's all very schlocky and it's just a wonderful movie. It really puts you in a good mood. But at any rate, early on in the movie, George gets married to Mary and they're on their way to their honeymoon and he sees all these people rushing to the Bailey Building and Loan. Okay, this is what is called a panic. Okay, this is a run on a bank. This is what they refer to as a bank run. People get the word, okay, that banks don't have enough liquidity to meet their depositors' needs. And so what do? They panic. And they rush to the bank to get out their money. Well, the problem is their money's not there. In this case, what happened is when they got the word, when the word spread, it's like an infectious disease. When the word spread that there wasn't enough money, okay, and principally that there wasn't enough gold, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their money and exchange it for gold. Well, the problem that I identified just earlier, about 5 minutes ago, okay, it's never a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so when people go, and with banking, the way it works is banks don't have all of their depositors' money on hand. They've lent it out. I mean, can you imagine what would happen to a bank? This is a bank run. If all of the people with deposits at that bank all rush to the bank at the same time, demanding their money, it's not there. The bank doesn't have enough of it. Okay? So what people are going to have to do is they're going to have to settle for what they have. If a bank has $100,000 in assets and 1,000 depositors, each depositor with $100, okay, and they've lent out all but 1,000 of that. They've lent out all but 1,000. They currently in their bank vaults have $1,000. The other $99,000 has been lent out to the community, okay, for building, for mortgages, for whatever, okay. Well, when all these 1,000 people come and they all demand their $100, they're all going to get 10 cents on a dollar. We've got $1,000 here. That's it. You're going to each get $1 out of the $100 deposit that you have, okay. This is what causes the panic. And once that happens in one bank, it becomes an insidious, infectious disease that spreads throughout. And what causes it? Panic. People panic. And there's a rousing speech, and this is one of those things that brings a tear to my eye when I watch the movie. There's a rousing speech by George Bailey to bring everybody back on board. Don't panic. Things will come back. We'll be okay. We've got to stick together. They don't do that. And so as a result, the banks begin this series of collapses. So you see in all, there's 9,000 bank failures. And this is going to be the real onset of the Depression. Okay, prior to that period, yes, it was an economic downturn. It was a recession. But this will make it a very pronounced depression with a reduction in productivity of upwards of 50%. Nobody has any money. Spending collapses. This is something that I think I've kind of gone at before in terms of, and this really gets us back into the idea of terms of trade. Think of this as terms of trade on an individual level, the individual level of an individual human being. It has to do with purchasing power. It's one of those things. I was explaining this to my wife the other day, which means about 3 weeks ago. But at any rate, people are all aflutter about the inflation rate. The inflation rate, in and of itself, is not a particularly interesting measure. What matters is the wage-price ratio. Okay, if inflation is prices are going up, okay, which means money loses its value, which is the actual definition of an inflation. But inflation, okay, by definition, is prices are rising. Okay, well, it means nothing to me if prices are rising, so long as my wage is rising at a compensatory level. Okay, and so we'll nurse out this little bit of an example here. Okay, let's say we have $100. Okay, and that's my wage, it's my savings, it's whatever, it's how much money I've got in my pocket. Okay, and prices are $10. That means I can buy 10 units of the thing. All right, so that's my purchasing power. Now let's continue. Okay, if both wages and prices rise commensurately with each other at 10%, you have 10% inflation, but you also have a 10% rise in wages. What does this mean? Well, the new wage, with a 10% increase, I now have $110 in my pocket. The new price at a 10% increase is $11. I can still buy 10 units. I'm no worse off than I was before. Okay? So my purchasing power has stayed the same. However, if prices rise faster than wages rise, then I'm going to have less purchasing power. Or if prices rise and my wage drops, I'm going to have less purchasing power. Or if prices drop slower than wages drop, I'm going to have less purchasing power. Okay? And so that's essentially what we have here. And I say here, reference the money multiplier from economy. I think we're going to skip that for right now. We'll deal with that later on, probably in Epoch 3, when we talk about some of the other difficulties that the economy has in the later 20th century. Now, the result of the onset of the Depression. This is something you should familiarize yourself with. This is what we call, what you see there. Here, I may as well use my laser pointer since I love to use the thing. Any excuse to use the laser pointer is a good excuse. You see right here, this is what's referred to as the debt cycle. And I want to explain it to you simply enough. And it's explained there, written down, but I'll explain it simply enough. Okay? As a result of whatever, you can start this process wherever the hell you want to start it. Okay? Real income drops, which means that discussion that I just gave you with purchasing power. Let's say your purchasing power drops. Let's say prices rise 10%, wages only rise 5%. So your purchasing power drops. As a result of your purchasing power dropping, you have less income. Because you have less income, you demand less. Because you're demanding less, producers don't need to supply as much. Because producers don't need to supply as much, they don't need as many people. They don't need as many workers. Okay, so the demand for labor drops. Well, because the demand for labor drops, when the demand of something drops and the supply stays the same, wages drop. Because wages drop, income drops. Because income drops, ... the cycle repeats itself. Okay, so people have less money, so they demand less. Because they demand less, producers produce less. Because producers produce less, they don't need as many workers. Because they don't need as many workers, wages drop. Because wages drop, income drops. Because income drops, demand drops, etc. And it reminds me, now, if we reverse that, okay, you have what's known as the growth cycle. Okay, and this really gets us into a discussion of the business cycles, which is a little beyond our scope right here, but that gives you a basic idea of it. All right, and what I was going to say is what it reminds me of is my favorite commercial. This is back from, oh God, this has got to be 20 years ago or so. It was my favorite anti-drug commercial. It was a commercial for cocaine. Or not for cocaine, I suppose that is a bad way of phrasing it, against cocaine. But there's this guy walking concentrically in a circle in a room, okay, and the camera pans in on it, and he says, I think the copy goes something like this. He says, I like doing cocaine because when I do cocaine, I work harder. And I like to work harder because when I work harder, I make more money. And I like to make more money because when I make more money, I can afford more cocaine. And I like to afford more cocaine because when I do cocaine, I work harder. And when I work harder, I can make more money. And when I make more money, I can buy more cocaine. And when I buy more cocaine, I can work harder. And when I work harder, I make more money. And so it just becomes this concentric circle, okay, spinning into oblivion. And that's kind of what you have here. And this is going to be the basis of Keynes's argument, which we're going to see in just a little while. Now, the results of the onset of the Depression, we saw all the bank failures. Now, we also have a reduction. Unemployment was a little bit greater than 25% of the labor force by 1933. From 1.5 million in 29 to over 12 million unemployed in 1933. This is the time, the famous scenes from the 1930s of the soup kitchens. Okay, and you have to understand at this point, until March of 1933, Herbert Hoover is in the White House. Okay, you don't have FDR and the New Deal coming on until later on in the year, in the spring of that year. Okay, so you don't have any kind of government assistance or anything like that. Now, simultaneously while this is taking place, and again demonstrating a lack of fundamental economic principles, the Congress will pass, Congress which is controlled by the conservatives, okay, controlled by the Republicans. We have Hoover, a Republican, a conservative in the White House. Congress is controlled by the Republicans and the conservatives, who all along, as we've studied all the way from the beginnings of our course in the late 19th century, favor protective tariffs to protect American manufacturing. They jump to an erroneous conclusion. The way to bring the manufacturing sector back is to give it a protected market. Okay, so rather than dropping tariffs and allowing foreign trade, they massively increase tariffs to an unprecedented level with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which will increase tariffs by upwards up to 50% on some products. Okay, and so what you have is you have a massive increase in prices. And so what do we have going on here? We have massive unemployment. Because of the massive unemployment, supply of labor way outstrips demand for labor. You have a reduction in production in general, okay? And so you have wages dropping. And so therefore people's income is dropping. Well, at the same time that's happening, as a result of the things you see here, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the corporate mergers, oligopolistic business practices, price fixing, etc., you have prices skyrocketing, okay? And so people literally can't buy enough food. People will start to starve to death. Okay. Hoover's response is now one of the things that has been mischaracterized by history is that while it's very similar. I don't know if you ever heard the catchphrase that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, referring to the fire of Rome under Emperor Nero, and they say that Nero did nothing about it. He fiddled while Rome burned. Well, in point of fact, that's not true. Nero actually carried buckets of water to try to turn it out. He devoted all of his resources to try to putting out the fire of Rome. He delegated authority. He actually did the best he could to command the situation. Well, it's also been characterized that Herbert Hoover, while the United States economy was burning, so to speak, metaphorically, that Herbert Hoover did nothing. That's not entirely true. Herbert Hoover tried to do something, but we have to remember that ideologically, Hoover is a Republican and a conservative and believes in laissez-faire economics. And so he does something, but he's very limited in his response. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is designed to restructure all of the debt in the United States and reduce the strain on the banking sector. This should increase bank reserves. In point of fact, it does. But you're talking about, at this point, closing the barn door after the horse has bolted. Okay? It's too little too late. You don't need a little bit of an influx of money into the banking sector and they'll get back on their feet. You need a massive influx. Okay? The tank, remember that example I showed you of how the credit system works with the metaphor of water? The tank is bone dry. Okay? Filling it up with a pint of water isn't going to get you where you need to go. It needs to be a river. You need a flood. Okay? Now, the other thing he's going to do is create the Federal Farm Board. Again, a decent enough idea. The idea is that you put production limits on farm products. What will that do? That will limit supply. When you limit supply, if you keep demand constant, that should raise farm prices, which should put more money in farmers' pockets, okay, making it easier for them to repay the banks. Oh, it's a good idea, Herbert Hoover. It's a good idea, Herb, but it's just too little too late. It's not enough to get the agricultural sector back on its feet. And Hoover's idea here is probably not too far off the mark. If you get the agricultural sector back on its feet and it's able to repay the banks, that will increase the liquidity of the banks sufficiently that it can stabilize the overall situation. Probably a good idea, Herb. Probably right. But just limiting farm production to reduce the supply and increase prices is not going to do it. That's not enough. Okay? He dramatically, where his fault was not really not attempting to do anything. He did attempt to do something. What his fault was he dramatically underestimated the dimensions of the catastrophe that had hit the American economy. Okay? And that's because he kind of, believed that everything, he believed his own press clippings. He believed the myth of the 1920s, that everything was booming, everything was fine, that this little glitch in the stock market and this little downturn is just a blip on the map. It's not a serious issue. It's not something that underscores structural problems in the economy. All you need to do is a little bit of stabilization and everything will be fine. Okay? No. You've underestimated. And this is what will ultimately cost him the election and lead to the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats in 1930. And that brings us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. Okay? FDR will be elected in 32. He will become essentially King Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We'll get into why that is in a minute here. The reason that he's going to sweep in with such a victory is, and he doesn't actually win the victory by as large a margin as you might imagine, but the laissez-faire, and we saw this is a repeat. History, what do they say? What do they always say? They always say history repeats itself. This is basically a repetition of the 1890s. Okay? What did we have in the late 19th century? We had the conservatives in charge of the government. We had a laissez-faire, hands-off economic policy where the government didn't interfere, didn't regulate, didn't do anything. We had this economic depression in the 1890s that resulted in the discrediting of the conservatives and the discrediting of laissez-faire economics. Same thing's going to happen here. You had the 1920s. There was this myth of a boom economy. Production was everything. Everybody was doing well. Everybody was financing things on consumer credit. All was right with the world. We were all like a, what is that, a Christmas story? We were all like little Ralphie who got his Red Ryder repeating BB rifle, right? All was right with the world, okay? Problem is, you're going to shoot your eye out, kid. And that's what they should have told them when they did. Well, at any rate, okay. So this discredits them again. It discredits the Republicans. It discredits laissez-faire economics. It discredits the conservative movement. And Roosevelt will come. And as I said, in the introductory video to this, which hopefully you watched, in the introductory video to this, like him or not, okay, whether you're opponent of Franklin Roosevelt or not, whether you're opponent of Keynesian economics or not, whatever you think of his policies, okay, it's irrelevant. He was and continues to be the most effective president in American history. When we measure effectiveness of a presidency by what they accomplish, okay, not in terms of its effect, not in terms of whether or not he fixed the economy, but in terms of logistically legislation that was passed under his administration. His first 100 days was the most effective 100 days of any president. Okay, overall, his administration was the most effective of any president, whether you agree with it or not. Okay. Now, a brief introduction into Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes wrote in the late 20s and 1930s, and his big work was published in 32. Okay, he's brought in by Roosevelt, okay, to advise on an economic plan in 33, to advise on an economic plan to fix the economy. Now, you see the theoretical basis of it, that what orthodox economics tells us and what monetarism tells us is that, and we won't get into it, it's way too tangential for our purposes in this class to get into it. If you want to know that, you have to study something like maybe U.S. economic history or my survey of economics I'm doing in the summertime from 28 June to 20 August, whichever session that is. I'm going to be doing U.S. economic history and survey of economics online. But when you look at this, even in micros and macros, but or macros more than micros. But at any rate, there is an orthodox economic theory and idea that the economy will fix itself. Now, there's a reason for this. When the economy goes into a downturn, wages drop, prices begin to drop because demand is down. Eventually, prices drop below the drop in wages, which means people have more money in their pocket. They'll start spending again. It'll trigger the growth cycle. Okay. Keynes disagrees with this. When we looked a couple of slides ago at the debt cycle, okay, income drops, demand drops, supply drops, labor drops. Remember that? Okay. Well, when we looked at that, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. What Keynes' argument is it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Monetary policy alone, okay, a laissez-faire approach, isn't going to stop that phenomenon. It will go on ad infinitum until everyone starves to death, okay? And so what you need to do, and this is the triumph of Keynesianism. Keynesianism, and we'll deal with this again, Keynesianism will dominate the American economy from this point, 1933, until present day. There will only be a couple of times that there are brief revisions to Keynesianism. Okay, and there's an inherent flaw. See, I tell my economics students this. I think that John Maynard Keynes is the arch prince of darkness. Okay, now it's a little unfair to say that because really what's applied in the United States, and this begins with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and continues to the modern day under the Obama administration, what's being applied isn't really the full-fledged, full-force Keynesian model. What's being applied is a modified Keynesian model, and we'll get into that in just a second. Okay, why it's been modified. And you see there, it's very simple. To stimulate economic growth, you have to do two things. Thing number one, you cut taxes. What happens when you cut taxes? People have more disposable income. If you drop my taxes, I have more money in my paycheck. Okay, I have more money to spend. That's going to stimulate demand. At the same time that you do that, you increase government spending. And so both of these things, this acts as a bishop's fork attack, okay, as a pincer attack on demand. You cut taxes, that increases people's income. They start to spend more. So that's on the private sector end. On the consumer end, that'll spur demand. You'll also spur demand because of government spending. The government itself will become a consumer. Okay? Now, of course, the result of this, and Keynes anticipated this, I mean, anybody with half a brain can see what's going to happen here. Okay? If you cut taxes, that means you're going to have a reduction in government income. Government revenue is based on taxes. That's where the government gets its money, through taxes. So if you cut taxes, government revenue will drop. And if you, at the same time, increased government spending, the government's going to have less money coming in, more money going out. Well, that's going to create a deficit. Keynes is like, that's right, it's going to create a deficit, not a problem. It's not a problem on a temporary basis. Why? Because what's it going to do? That's going to increase demand, which is going to stimulate the economy and stimulate growth. Because it stimulates growth, everybody's going to earn more money. At a future time, then, you can increase taxes, reduce government spending, and pay off that deficit. So it's a temporary situation. Okay? Problem was, so that's the basics of Keynesian economics. Now, and we'll deal with the problem in just a second here. I'll get to the problem in a little while. It has to do with placing such an economic system in an open political system. And this is what Keynes doesn't see. This is the failure of Keynes's model. Okay, Keynes is looking at this as though economics exists in a vacuum without political factors. When you place that model into an open political system, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, first and foremost, what Roosevelt's going to do, okay, is three big things, and you see them here on this slide. In April of 33, this is the month he comes into office. This is his first 30 days in office. He will pull the United States off the gold standard. For reasons that I talked about earlier at great length, okay, being on the gold standard limited the supply of money, limited the amount of money that the Federal Reserve could release into the system. Get rid of the gold standard. Gold is no longer transferable for money, okay? That means that you can pump money into the system to stimulate the economy. Okay, other nations will follow this. Once the United States leaves the gold standard, Great Britain will, France will, Germany does. This is now Germany in 1933. For those of us who are students of European history, is the rise of the National Socialists. The National Socialists will gain a plurality in the Reichstag election of 1933, and that will begin the rise of the National Socialists, of Nazis, and move towards World War II. They will also pass the Emergency Banking Act. The Emergency Banking Act gives a 1-week bank holiday. This will stop the runs on banks. This is March of 1933. This is actually the day he comes into office. He does this. Okay. So in March of 33, it's a 1-week bank holiday. That ends all of the bank runs. Okay, banks are all closed, so nobody can go to the bank and demand their money now. That's going to stop the panic. Okay, he's going to create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which we've all probably at this point heard of, which will insure depositors. It will be federal government insured deposits, so that you don't have to run the risk of losing your deposit because the bank doesn't have enough money. Remember the example I used? The bank lent out all my money, so if we all go to the bank at once to demand our deposits, they're not going to have enough money to pay us off, and we'll have to settle for 10 cents on a dollar. Well, with the FDIC, you don't have to worry about that. And it's not so much. Now, this is the interesting thing. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has actually paid off very little. They don't need to. Okay? What it does is it creates a security in the mind of the depositor. The reason that I rush to the bank, because I'm worried that they're not going to have enough money to meet all of the demands of their various depositors, including me, okay, I panic because I figure everybody's going to rush. They're going to pull out their money, and when I go to the bank to withdraw some money, it's not going to be there. Now I don't have to worry about that. It's insured by the national government. As a result of that, I don't have to run to the bank. Okay? So it will end the bank runs. People will be more secure in the idea that there's going to be enough money there. The fact that at the time there isn't really is meaningless. Now, another thing that they're going to pass, and this is in 35, is the Glass-Steagall Act. Okay, and this is worth noting because it's been recently, and I mean in the last 4 years, bandied about again to bring Glass-Steagall back. The Reagan administration in the 1980s repeals the Glass-Steagall Act. They're thinking about bringing it back. What the Glass-Steagall Act does is separate commercial banking from investment banking. Okay, what the Roosevelt administration had come to the conclusion of, probably correctly, was that one of the difficulties, one of the things that led to the strain on the commercial banking sector, okay, was that the commercial banking sector was using its depositors' money not just for mortgages and things like that, but for making investments, okay, particularly in the stock market and things like that. So these commercial banks held investment portfolios. the way an investment bank does. Okay? And as a result, the commercial banks, this put extra strain on their actual liquidity, okay, on the actual deposits, the cash they had on hand to give back to depositors when depositors came to the bank. Okay, so separate those two. Don't allow commercial banks to do that anymore. And the weird thing is that they haven't brought that back on, but a lot of the banks themselves have begun to do this. Okay, and so I'll give you an example. Mortgage on my house here, okay, is held through Bank of America. I just refinanced it. We just negotiated. Okay, so it's held by Bank of America. Well, Bank of America used to do investment banking as well. Now they don't. They have a subsidiary company, a corporation known as U.S. Trust. U.S. Trust is their investment corporation. That's where I have my investment portfolio, is with U.S. Trust. The mortgage is held by Bank of America. And so that's Glass-Steagall. All right. They will also pass the Security Act, which will set up the Security and Exchange Commission. Okay. The Security Exchange Commission will oversee business practices. They will monitor corporate consolidations. It will make price fixing and other oligopolistic business practices illegal. Among them, insider trading will be made illegal as a result of the Security Act. Okay? Why? Well, because what did I suggest just shortly ago, maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago? What did I suggest on that one slide? And we dealt with this in the late 19th century as well. When the consolidations take place and the oligopolies are created, they engage in price fixing. This artificially inflates prices. Okay? Well, we're going to create a commission and a law that's going to prohibit them from doing that. All right? That will eliminate this artificial increase in prices resulting from the corporate conglomerations. Okay? We're also going to oversee conglomerations and not allow oligopolies to form. Okay? And I won't get into the hardcore economics of that. I'll spare you that. Okay? How that's done. But here's something to stick in the back of your head while we're going over this, though, is you tell me. Now this is on an overt level. It's illegal for producers of the same product to collaborate and determine a price. Okay, because it's a non-competitive business practice. But you tell me from your own experience that this doesn't happen. They might not get together. They don't get together and collaborate and determine it. You know, they don't sit in the basement of some room smoking stogies and you know, it's all cloak and dagger and they determine to fix prices. But you tell me price fixing doesn't happen. You go ahead. You drive. You go. Well, I don't know where the hell you are right now. Okay, wherever you are right now, look at a 5-mile radius around wherever you are. Look at all of the gas stations. All of the gas prices are within a nickel of each other. That's price fixing. It's not illegal. Okay, you tell me the gas station owner. Okay, the Indian guy what owns the gas station down the road from you. You tell me he doesn't get in his car and drive in maybe a 5 or 10 mile radius around his gas station and see what everybody else is charging for their gas and then determine his price based on that. But at any rate, that's a little bit tangential, right? Okay. Now, the other thing he's going to create is the Federal Emergency Relief Agency. Boo, hiss. These are the guys I'm at war with right now. These are the guys who decided last year. I've been in this house for 7 years. I got a little tiny little stream behind my house called the McKinley Run. Oh, it's a tiny little stream. I mean, when I go to the bathroom, I pee more than runs through that stream most of the time. Okay, that stream is usually most of the year a trickle. They determined that as a result of me being there, close to the McKinley, that I am in an SFHA, a Special Flood Hazard Area, and I got to buy flood insurance. Okay, which was $1,500 a year. All right, so boo, hiss. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, you guys aren't here, right? But if you were to look at this place, if that little river, if that little stream floods, My house flooding is the least of my concerns. Okay? The only way that stream's going to flood is if we are at the rapture. I mean, we're at the end of days here. Okay? I got to build an ark if that thing floods. Okay? So that's just absolutely absurd. But I did recently win a victory. I didn't really win a victory. I was given a victory. Evidently, when I complained because what my bankers, when I was refinancing this loan on my house, what my bankers told me was that, well, our policy, this is an internal bank policy, is that you got to have, if FEMA says you got to have flood insurance, okay, which you have to have on any federally guaranteed loan, which all mortgages are federally guaranteed through Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae at this point, but you got a federally guaranteed loan, all right, you got to hold the flood insurance. FEMA gets to dictate that. All right, fine, whatever. I hate FEMA with a venomous passion as a result of this, but whatever. And you know why FEMA did it? FEMA did it because they had to pay off for Katrina down in New Orleans and this disaster up in New York. Okay, so because somebody built their house on the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta and it flooded out, I got to buy flood insurance. The hell sense does that make? But at any rate, now I'm off on. Hold on, let me rein it back right on that. Rein it back in here. But what Bank of America said was, well, no. Your flood insurance, which you have to have because of FEMA dictates, okay, has to match your hazard insurance, and your hazard insurance has to be replacement value of your house. So my hazard insurance, my homeowners, is $147,000. Well, the flood insurance would be $1,500. It's 1% of the value, because that means I'd have to hold flood insurance for $147,000. Last week, Bank of America changed its policy. I don't have to have flood insurance equal to my hazard insurance. I only have to have flood insurance equal to the outstanding principal of the loan, okay, which at this point is $39,000, which means that I only have to pay $390 a year instead of $1,500. So I save about $1,100 because of this change in policy. Evidently, I wasn't the only one that complained to the Bank of America about this asinine policy, and so that got me a little bit of a break on my adjunct faculty salary, which is virtually non-existent. But at any rate, funds given to state and local agencies. All right, well, that's FEMA's now broke, basically. Okay. Now, in addition to those, that's the first spat. The second spat in this first New Deal that Roosevelt's going to have is going to be effectively what would be referred to, I guess loosely, as workfare. The government itself is going to become one of the primary employers. Simple idea. Simple. This is what in 2008, okay, the stimulus of the economy was called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARIA. Okay, basic idea is simple. You don't have to have an economics degree to understand it. It's a basic, simple idea. You put people back to work. When the people are back working, they're making an income. When they make an income, they buy things. Simple enough. By putting them back to work, you put money in their pockets. When they have money in their pockets, they spend it. That stimulates demand and stimulates growth. It's not difficult to understand. Okay? Well, that's what's going to happen. That's why you have all these road construction projects, right? But at any rate, that's what Roosevelt's going to do. He's going to create the Civil Workers Administration, okay? And this is going to be for infrastructure development. Early on in the New Deal, that's what Roosevelt's going to do an awful lot of, is infrastructure development. He'll create the Public Works Administration, which has the same objective as the Civil Works Administration. This is 33 and 34, government-created jobs. You hire people to dig ditches. You hire people to build roads. You hire people to build dams, okay? The Civil Conservation Corps, that's specifically government jobs for conservation. You hire them in national parks, etc., okay? So you put millions of people back to work. This is all going to be financed by the government. It's all going to be financed by deficit spending, okay? Because you've cut taxes to the bone. Two things have happened. One, you've cut taxes to the bone. And two, because the economy's in the dumper, because unemployment's so high, nobody's making any money, so nobody's being able to pay taxes. All right? So you've got very little money coming in, and you're massively increasing spending. This is straight Keynesianism. Okay? The idea being that, okay, we increase spending, we create all these government works projects, everybody gets back out there, gets working, they all start making money again. Once they start making money again, they start paying taxes again, government revenue goes up, and the deficit reduces, etc. Okay. Now, as I'd mentioned before, the agricultural sector is the one that is probably the hardest hit. And as I also suggested with Hoover, his attempt at alleviating the problems on the farming sector really was too little too late. Well, Roosevelt's going to throw his efforts into this too, and he's going to create the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. You see there what it's going to do. We're going to give farm subsidies for the reduction in farming production. Here's the problem with Hoover's plan, okay? Well, I mean, the economics behind it is sound, right? Reduce the supply of farm products. Farmers produce less. You set a production limit. So farmers produce less. They produce less, that reduces supply. They reduce supply, that increases the price. They got more money per unit coming in. The problem is they're actually not able to make any money off of it. Okay? What you've got to do is subsidize them. All right? So in other words, if we've got a farmer that's producing, I don't know, 100 ears of corn, 100 ear of corn, okay, we'll keep the math simple, $1 a piece. Well, that's $100. We say, well, what we want to do is increase the price of that corn so we can make some more money. So we're going to put a limit on it that you can only produce 50-ear corn, okay, and that'll increase the price. Well, the problem is that while there's a time lag while that's taking place, I'm out $50, okay, which makes it impossible for me to repay my debt. Now, instead, what we're going to do is eventually that's going to cause prices to go up. In the meantime, we're going to give you the $50. This is the famous government program. It ran all the way through the 80s. They still do it a little bit, not as much, where you pay farmers not to produce, because that keeps farm products at an artificially high level. The other thing they're going to do, particularly with the dairy industry, is say, okay, you keep production levels. You keep right where you are, but you keep the product off the market. The government itself will buy the product and then destroy it. And that's what they do. There's images. I do a lot of substitute teaching for Dr. Litzinger over in economics. I substitute for his class quite a bit. I'm happy to do it. It's a great fun to do survey of economics, things like that. But he's big on this. There's a series of videos called Economics USA. And one of the images when it deals with the Great Depression is literally dumping milk down sewers. Okay, literally that's what you're going to do. It's a form of subsidization. The farmers keep producing. They maintain their productive capacity. They maintain the production levels. Okay, because the problem is if you place a cap on how much they can produce, well, then they're not going to need as much labor, and that's going to increase unemployment. No. Keep their workers. Keep their production levels the same as always, but keep half of it off the market. Government buys half of it themselves and just dumps it down a rat hole, dump it down the sewer, throw it in the ocean, do whatever the hell you want with it. Okay? Now, the problem is, as you see here, it's counterproductive. The Dust Bowl referred to earlier already reduced farm production. With the government subsidies from the AAA, farmers increase capital and reduce labor. Okay? What they do with the subsidies, in other words, is they buy capital equipment that allows them to produce both more cheaply, reducing their cost of production, and with fewer laborers. And so it's counterproductive. Ultimately, the Supreme Court in 1936 will rule that the Agricultural Adjustment Administration is unconstitutional, okay, because the government doesn't have the authority to do this under the Constitution. The National Industries Recovery Act is going to attempt to stabilize the manufacturing sector. And you see here the suspension of antitrust laws to allow consolidation of redundant industries. Okay, We don't need to get into the hardcore economics of that. When you have too many producers, you have redundant production. This increases the overall cost of production in the industry. Instead, some of these consolidations can be helpful in reducing that redundancy. You create production quotas. This is the same thing we'll do with the farmers to limit the supply, and you'll create price ceilings, okay, to reduce the artificial increase in retail prices and commercial prices for things, okay? And in the National Industry Recovery Act, Section 7 will include the Independent National Labor Relations Act, which allows unions to form. It makes it illegal to stop a union from forming, okay? And this will also create the National Labor Relations Board to oversee unionization. Here we have some additional initiatives: the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, which refinances farm mortgages; the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is infrastructure development, exactly what it says in Appalachia. Appalachia at this time, Appalachia currently, in the modern period, same as in the 1930s, is the most depressed area of the United States, running from, roughly from Arkansas in a northeasterly swath all the way through Kentucky and West Virginia. That traditionally is the most depressed area in the country. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority is designed to pick that up the most, right? And so it's for government works projects, mostly building of dams, infrastructure development. Then you have the Farm Credit Act, increased availability of credit to agricultural sector, okay? The results of it? It has to be, okay? Theoretically, okay, on paper, this has to work. There's no way it can't work. Okay, if people increase spending, which this does, the economy has to grow a little bit. Well, you'll see. GDP increases from 42.7 billion in 33 to 75 billion in 37. Very successful. Supply of money increased from 32.3 billion in 32 to 45.7 billion in 37. And again, this data is from Walton and Rockoff. However, it's temporary. By the middle of 37, the economy slumps back into a recession. This is ultimately the problem with the Keynesian model. The reason that this growth is taking place is because the government is pumping money into the economy, either through increased government spending or by reducing taxes and allowing the private sector to pump money into the system. Okay? Both of them it's usually a combination of the two. Well, the problem is that once you stop pumping that money into the system, it returns to its normal level. It's all artificial. You're artificially stimulating it. It's like pumping steroids into the human body. Eventually, it renders it inert. Okay? And so production in 37, despite all of that growth, despite everything the New Deal had done, the production level in 37 was still under the production level of 1929. Between 29 and 37, you still haven't grown at all. Okay? Why? Because there's been insufficient investment. Okay? And we'll deal with that in just a second. I mentioned it in the introductory video. We'll deal with it full force in just a second. As a result of this, Roosevelt becomes convinced that far from the New Deal not being theoretically sound, it just simply hasn't gone far enough. It needs greater stimulation. This will lead us to the second New Deal, okay, which really begins in 35. By 35, the Roosevelt administration sees that first New Deal is eventually going to peter out, okay? And it's the idea, it's a simple idea, really, okay? And we'll deal with it again in EPLOC 3 a little bit, but it's a simple enough idea, okay? If our idea is to increase people's income by giving them a job, okay, we get people to build a road. That's great, okay? We hire 50 workers to build the road. That's great. That gives those 50 people income. All right, great. Puts more money in their pocket, they spend it. Well, what happens once that road's built? Well, once that road's built, they're all back on the unemployment line again. Okay? If we hire these people to build a dam, once the dam's built, what do we do with them then? They all go back into the unemployment line. Okay? That's the problem with the government works projects. We see that now. Okay? um, okay. Now, we've passed the Revenue Act. More progressive graduated income tax, close off the loopholes, adjust to some of the tax evasion that's taking place. Yeah, all right, but that's just not going to fuel your economy enough. That's not enough. You're talking literally change. Okay, yeah, that's small potatoes. With Glass-Steagall in 1935, deposits are greater than withdrawals, but because of the statute, these deposits could not be used for investment. So the Glass-Steagall Act, which was designed to prevent commercial banking from making investments, okay, and therefore reducing their liquidity for depositors, is actually going to limit the potential growth in the economy because you're preventing them from using that money for investment in capital, which would increase productive capacity and create long-term growth. That's why the Reagan administration repeals it in the 80s. Now we're going to have also, with the Second New Deal, the creation of what is more appropriately referred to as the welfare state. We're going to have the creation of the Social Security Act. Okay, this will be the introduction of Social Security. Okay, which will serve as a government pension. They will also create unemployment compensation. Okay, unemployment insurance, which is for people that are temporarily unemployed. They'll be able to keep an income. Now, the reason for this, what you want to do on the theoretical level, okay, to raise the level of abstraction, and think about this for just a minute. What you need to do in this model, in this idea that we're working with, what you need to do is keep demand up. You need people to keep spending money. Well, when people go into retirement and aren't pulling in a paycheck anymore, they don't have money to spend. Okay? You give them Social Security, a government pension. Okay? When people are thrown out of work and they go on the unemployment line, they don't have money to spend. We give them unemployment insurance worth a certain percentage of their income. They can then continue to spend money. We've got to keep them spending. All right? All makes sense. Banking Act of 1935, greater role for the Federal Reserve to regulate banking, reduces the flexibility of banks. Okay, the idea is to gain a little bit more control so that banks don't overlend money. Resettlement Administration, the federal agency to oversee resettlement of refugees from the agricultural sector. This is as a result of the Great Dust Bowl. For those of us who are fans of John Steinbeck's, I'm not a fan of John Steinbeck's. I like a couple of his books. I like The Grapes of Wrath. I like Of Mice and Men, but for the most part, I think Steinbeck's writing is all on the Great Depression, with the exception of one book, I think. He writes all on the Great Depression, and I find them boring as hell. But in The Grapes of Wrath, which was characterized, again, back to U.S. history through movies, you have Henry Fonda in a brilliant performance as Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. But there was this myth throughout the Midwest that conditions were better elsewhere, particularly in California. And so one day, Henry Fonda, as Tom Joad, packs up the family in the truck with all their worldly possessions and drives out to California to seek their fortune. Well, this is what the Resettlement Administration did. The Resettlement Administration made money available for farmers who'd lost their mortgages, who'd lost their farms, to resettle elsewhere. Okay? Ultimately, yeah, I mean, it alleviates a little bit of the problem, but it doesn't fix the overall structural problem in the economy itself. Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, $5 billion for works projects, an additional $5 billion is released. Now, I mentioned this in the introductory video, and here we have with greater clarity in a diagram. Here's the debate that we get into. All right. If we look at this line, this is familiar to those of you who've done anything with survey of economics or macroeconomics. This is your production possibility curve. Okay. What that represents is the full use of all of your resources. This is the country's productive capacity. Actually, it's the economic unit's productive capacity. It could be for an individual as well. But at any rate, we're dealing with macroeconomics. We're dealing with the country. So this is the maximum the country can produce. Well, when we fall into the depression, we fall into a recession, the first thing that happens is productive capacity is reduced. Not productive capacity so much as we lay people off. In layman's terms, we lay people off. Okay? We reduce labor. This means we have unused capacity. We fall back to this actual production level. This is what happened in the Great Depression. Okay? Only really we fell back to a point closer to right here. Okay? Well, what the entirety of the New Deal, what Keynesian economics is based on, and what the entire New Deal is based on is the idea that what you need to do is stimulate growth and demand in the economy, either in the private sector through tax breaks or the government sector through increased government spending or a combination of the two, to push actual production back towards your limit. No reference is made towards actually increasing the curve itself, to bringing the curve out to a point out here somewhere. Okay? And that's the argument against it. That's why it's short-lived. Okay? And we had from a couple of slides ago that, yes, the New Deal, okay, here we are. We've dropped production down to here. The New Deal stimulates growth, stimulates increases in production, pushes it back towards the production possibilities curve, and by 37, it had pulled it back to about 95%. The production possibilities curve topped out in 1929. Okay? That was when it was at full tilt. The Depression happens, it falls back to here. The New Deal happens, it pushes it back, but by 37, you're now at this level. Okay? It begins to fall back again. And so what does Roosevelt do? The second New Deal. Pump more money into the economy to push it back to this level. You still haven't done anything to increase the level itself. Okay? To do that, you need investment. Now, for the Keynesians, as I mentioned in the introductory video, their argument is, and it's a completely rational argument, wait a minute, okay, here's my productive capacity. If I'm producing down here, why in the hell do I need to push this curve outward? I'm already not using all of the productive capacity I've got. First, let's bring us back to here. Then let's worry about pushing this out. Okay? Pushing this outward, that's long-term growth. Any movement within here, that's short-term growth. Okay? So Keynesianism is really based on short-term growth. And so what the monetarists argue is no. What's going to happen is what we saw in the Great Depression. That's right. The New Deal worked. It brought it back. Okay? It pushed it back towards the production possibility curve. But once it reached near that level, it fell back again. Okay? Started to fall back again. So you had to stimulate it again. You keep having to stimulate it with more and more money just to bring it back to its original level. Whereas if instead you had done some investment, and it's true, the Roosevelt administration did some investment. Infrastructure development constitutes an investment. It constitutes an increase in productive capacity. But it wasn't enough. Okay? And so therein the debate lies, is whether or not you actually need to create investment. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't seem like you need to. The Keynesian argument on a simple level is rational enough that first you've got to maximize the use of what you've got rather than getting more. But in the long run, you're not going to create the growth you need. This is what World War II will do. In World War II, they'll massively increase their productive capacity. And the idea that I gave is kind of a numerical example, a simple numerical example is, okay, it's a difference between looking at it in absolute numbers or as percentages. Let's say you produce, and I want to keep the numbers simple. Let's say you produce 100 units, maximum of anything. That's 100 units of consumer goods or 100 units of military goods or anywhere along this line, okay? Well, a recession happens, the Great Depression hits, we drop back to the production of 50 units. That's 50%. Okay, so we're producing at 50%. We're producing 50 units. What will happen with the New Deal is it will push us back towards the production of 100 units. The problem is, and this is from the monetarist point, is we're not dealing in absolute terms. We're dealing as a percentage, and it's based on something that I'm not going to get into right now, which is marginal propensities. Okay? You're still going to be producing as percentages. Okay? So if you drop down to producing 50%, 50 units out of 100, and then bring it back to producing nearly 100 units, you haven't actually done anything for long-term growth. Instead, if you had increased this, the potential production, up to 150 units, you could still produce at 50% and be producing 75 units. You would still have experienced some growth. It makes it a lot easier to get you back to your 100-unit level. At 100 units, you'd be producing at 2/3. Okay, so if you have 100, if we pushed it out through investment to 150, okay, and to produce 100 units, you have to be at 67% capacity. Okay, if we pushed it all the way out to 200 units as our productive capacity, maximum potential production, and we produced at 50%, we'd be producing the 100 units we were producing before the Depression started. Okay, and there's the debate. Okay. Now, here's the ultimate problem. This is the legacy of the New Deal. Here's the problem with the Keynesian model in an open political system. Okay? All right. What is Keynes telling us? What is the model based on? We cut taxes. That gives people more income. They can then spend. That will stimulate growth from the private sector. Okay. Makes sense. That's rational. Gotcha. Okay? Same time, you increase government spending. This makes government a demander itself. That's going to increase demand. Okay? Makes sense. I'm with you so far. Then at some future time, what this is going to do, this combination is going to do, is create growth in the economy. Okay? Because of that growth, at some future date, I can then increase taxes, reduce spending, make myself a surplus, pay off that debt. Okay, that makes perfect sense. The only problem with it is, try to implement that in an open political system. Now, what we mean by an open political system, I cover this in comparative political systems, and it's a little beyond our scope here, but an open political system is characterized by three principal things: competitive elections, ideological diversity, and political participation. Okay, what we study in comparative political systems is the distinction between a closed political system, which at its extreme is pure totalitarianism like Nazi Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, or an open political system. And then what we would do is we would look at different political systems and where they fit here and what the ramifications of that are, etc., 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 okay? Well, in an open political system, what that means is that the people, the politicians, okay, the office holders, are subject to regular elections by a participatory population. Well, during an election, in the United States, for example, the election cycle exists in 3 time frames: 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. 2 years for the House of Representatives, 4 years for the presidency, 6 years for the Senate. That means you have a 2-year gap. John Maynard Keynes, Johnny boy, you've got a 2-year gap. 2 years, that's what you've got, is a gap. Okay? To increase taxes and decrease spending to try to develop a surplus to pay off that deficit. That ain't going to happen. What happens is these members of the House of Representatives, because they're up for election in 2 years, literally, the moment they take office after winning an election, they have to start campaigning again for the next election cycle. They are not going to go out there to their constituency and say, okay, guys, and explain the academics behind, the economic theory behind Keynesianism and say, okay, we've created some growth now. Now what we've got to do is raise your taxes and reduce government spending. Nobody wants to hear that. Okay, if my representative comes to me and says, okay, and explains this whole Keynesian model to me, okay, explains the whole thing to me and says, so now we're at a point where I've got to raise your taxes and cut government spending. Okay, so there will be less government goodies around, all right? We'll do less road construction, less this, less everything. As soon as I hear him say, I'm going to raise your taxes, I say, I'm not going to vote for you. Get the hell out. All right? That's the problem with putting in an open political system. And that's why I say what's really implemented in the United States is not the full-fledged Keynesian model, which within its own economic parameters is logically sound. It's a hybrid of the Keynesian model. It's the reduced taxes and increased spending without the other part ever paying off the deficit. And the reason you can implement this, and it's really kind of interesting from an economic standpoint nowadays, to look at this, okay, and what happens is, what are the long-term effects? I'm talking generations. I'm talking 40, 50 years of running consistent deficits, running a debt perpetually. Okay? What's the effect of this? Okay? This is stuff that we're going to get into more in Epoch 3. Now, second thing, as a result of the New Deal, government intervention in the marketplace is an accepted practice. It's no longer a question. It was a question up until this point, what we looked at previously in our class. Okay? We had this distinction between, we had the conservatives that came in that were very laissez-faire, hands-off, no intervention in the marketplace. And we had the more progressives, and later on the Democrats, which were, we need some government regulation, etc., etc. During that entire debate, by the way, there was never any discussion of the government actually doing anything to stimulate the economy. That's brand new with the New Deal. Okay? Well, nowadays, it's no longer a debate as to whether or not the government should involve itself in the economy. It's now a question of how much should it do? Okay? How much intervention should there be? All right? And so government intervention, and we notice this, okay, on a kind of mundane, practical, psychological level with people. Okay? Whenever anything bad happens, particularly in the economy, people's first reaction is that, the government should do something. They turn to the government immediately to fix the problem. That's the legacy, one of the legacies of the New Deal. Okay? And so we have overall what this is going to do, and you see this at the end here, is massively expand the role of government. This is going to increase government power precipitously. Okay,